All right, welcome everybody to the VARC Solutions Bookkeeping Academy. Today is going to be a little bit of an open discussion conversation. Feel free to share your video on screen. We can all look at each other and talk to each other, etc. If you're not already showing it. But one of the things we want to talk about today is just the QuickBooks Desktop archive and condense feature. And I thought it'd be good just to have just a dialogue on this. I know sometimes clients, especially that have been using QuickBooks Desktop, Pro, Premier, Enterprise for a long time, the file gets big, it gets slow. Reports sometimes will take longer to run. You open up, you hit receive payment for a customer and it takes 2 minutes to process behind the scenes before you can go make a deposit. I mean, there's lots of things that can kind of happen when the file gets too big. And so one of the topics that sometimes comes up is how do we make the file smaller so it'll run faster, right? And so, I think sometimes the knee-jerk reaction is to do the archive and condense within QuickBooks Desktop, but I know that there's some downsides to doing that. For what it's worth, I don't believe QuickBooks Online has any comparable feature related to making a file size smaller, okay, in QBO. So I think this is primarily a QuickBooks Desktop conversation. What I want to do is I want to just pull up the feature. I'm going to walk through the screen so you know what in the world I'm talking about. But then again, I think let's talk about why we shouldn't use this tool, or what are some of the alternatives that we could recommend to clients if their file is getting big and it's getting slow. And I know we've got a few folks on the call today that are resident experts in this that can give us some good comments and suggestions. So again, let me just pull up the screen here. I'm going to share my QuickBooks Desktop screen, and that way we can go from there. So give me a second here. Okay, everybody should see my QuickBooks Desktop screen. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just in a sample file. I happen to be in QuickBooks Enterprise Solutions in a sample file. So one of the first questions that might come up is, well, how big is the file? If we're trying to make a file size smaller, how big is it? If you press the Control key plus the, hang on, let me get to the right screen there. If you press Control plus the number 1 key, it'll bring up this product information window. And I think there's also an F keyboard keyboard shortcut that'll bring up the same thing. From memory, I believe it's F2, but Control perfect brings it up. And so on that product information screen, you can kind of see, okay, what version they're on, what release they're on, etc. But more importantly, you can see the file size. And so this particular sample file is not big. It's only, what, 39 megabytes. But let's say that said, the equivalent of 4 gigabytes or 2 gigabytes. That's when things tend to start slowing down a lot. If you ever hear the word targets, that's also where you can see the number of targets. And this becomes important because if people are on desktop and they're looking to migrate to QuickBooks Online, that migration process has limits in terms of file size. It has limits in terms of numbers of targets. And so sometimes that is the goal as well, is like, hey, can we make this file smaller so it can be migrated? That kind of concept, okay? So with that as a little bit of context, if I go to File, Utilities, Condense Data, that's what we're talking about, that particular feature. This is only available in single user mode. You have to be an administrator. So if other people in the file, you got to kick them out, switch to single user mode. Right there, file switch to either single or multiple, but go to single. And then condense data. And part of why I wanted to bring this up was to show you this is not something you should be afraid of clicking. Okay, it's not going to just do it and then make everything worse. So I'm going to step through the form, and when it gets to that last little button that says begin condense, that's where we're going to stop. Okay. But just to kind of show you some of the options here, you can, the first option, I think, from my experience, is fairly safe. We're not talking about messing anything up here, but it says keep all transactions, but remove the audit trail. And so removing the audit trail, sort of like the history of changes, deletions, vendor name changes, things like that, that is something that you can do. And I think we have done that for specific clients when they've tried to make their file a little bit smaller. That one is not as scary. I mean, I think unless you need to do that, you shouldn't, right? Having the audit trail is really helpful. But the second option is the one that's a little bit more scary, where it is actually going into the file and removing transactions and potentially lists as well that are not being used anymore. This is the one that's a little bit scary. So I'm going to do that one though. Remove all transactions, or remove transactions from the file. And there's a couple different options here. First off is more of a, what date range are we talking about? So I could say I want to remove all transactions, but keep lists and preferences. This is really, I think, an option for, I just want to create a brand new company file that has nothing in it in terms of transactions. But I want to keep the lists and preferences, kind of like starting a brand new file. Okay. I guess the alternative there would be to just create a brand new company file from scratch, import the chart of accounts, but then you'd still have to deal with like exporting customer lists, importing customer lists, things like that. So this is trying to do the same thing there. If you're trying to remove transactions before a certain date, okay, that's one option. The other is to create a period copy of the file where you're literally saying get rid of everything prior to a specific date and after a specific date, like if you were just trying to have a file that isolated like 1 year. Okay. Again, I think when somebody is looking at this option, they're probably thinking about and trying to get rid of old stuff, not new stuff. So you might say, okay, well, I want to get rid of everything prior to 1/1/22, for example, right? That would keep all of 22, 23, 24, 25. And so basically, 3.5, 4 years worth. If that wasn't enough, you could try 2023, okay, that kind of thing. Okay. The next screen says, how should transactions be summarized? So what condensing is doing is it's getting rid of transactions that are no longer needed. Like I don't need that detail anymore. I don't need to see, the invoices for, these 100 different customers dating back to 1999. Maybe I don't need that detail anymore. But it's going to replace those details with journal entries, okay, unless I tell it not to. But so I can tell it to create one summary journal entry, and it's going to replace everything prior to that, it says, with a single journal entry, okay? Or you can do it journal entries by month from that archive condensed date anything it's going to get removed, it'll do a journal entry by month, okay? Or you could say don't create a summary at all, and it's going to remove everything prior to that date, regardless of status, okay? And no journal entries are going to be summarized. Basically, your financials at that point would be crap because all of the balances, it just wouldn't work, right? So creating one summary journal entry would be an option. You can tell it what to do with inventory transactions. And notice it says remove all condensable inventory transaction and replace those with inventory adjustments. Or you can tell it to keep inventory transactions. Again, I don't want to get into the minutia here, but generally speaking, if you get rid of inventory transactions, that could affect things like, your cost of goods sold, your average cost, potentially inventory valuations. So that is something just to be very careful about. Here's what the next thing says. Do you want to remove the following transactions? And I think, in my mind, again, this is a little bit scary because it says QuickBooks recommends that you remove the following transactions. And in part of what it's recommending you should remove, it includes uncleared, unreconciled bank and credit card transactions, which I wouldn't recommend that. If something hasn't cleared, I wouldn't recommend removing the transaction. Now, again, if we're talking about a check that hasn't cleared, prior to the condensed date, 2022, 2021, 2020, you should have already dealt with that, right? You should have done, an adjusting entry in the current period to then offset that transaction that's never going to clear in the old period, basically doing, basically in calling the bank and doing the stop payment, or, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't recommend getting rid of uncleared bank and credit card transactions, but some of these other ones do make sense. Like if you've got lots of transactions that haven't been printed, and that's the only reason why they wouldn't be removed, you could get rid of transactions prior to the close date that are marked to be printed or to be emailed. All non-posting transactions like estimates, sales orders, POs, and pending invoices, time and mileage activities, time containing unbilled expenses. Okay, so those are things that you can take a look at and make decisions about. What's interesting about this also is if you, for example, let's say you had a file that had thousands of invoices and you archive and condense all of those invoices, and now you've got 100 customers that now no longer have any activity associated with them. It's basically saying, do you want to now get rid of those customers that are no longer being used? Okay, so that's a way of also condensing your customer list, your vendor list, your items list, things like that. Again, it's just something to know about and think about. And then this is where we're going to stop and then have a conversation. So the next step at this point would be to begin a condense. I haven't clicked that button. I'm sure it does a backup, or if you haven't done a backup, you should do a backup before you do this, just to be sure. But let's pause here and have a conversation about why we should or maybe shouldn't do this in the first place, now that you have a little bit of understanding about what it is and what it does. Anybody want to share some comments?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy.
So what I see mainly is that the condense function would be fabulous if it worked. But what we see time and time again is that it just wrecks the file, and financials no longer match. A lot of times they will come back corrupted. And I don't have to go into examples of that because they're all different. But I will tell you some of the things I do use the condensed file for, and maybe that might help.
Yep.
So one of the things that I do a lot for VARC is create new files for people. And I will get these questions like, I don't want to bring in any customers that we haven't messed with in, 5 years. Okay, fine, that's great. So I may take a backup of the company file, just kind of create a sandbox, if you will. I will do the condense for 5 years ago, and I almost don't even care if it works properly. But if I remove those unused list items, I may get a smaller, cleaner customer list, things like that. So when I do go to export the customer list to then turn around and bring into a new file, even if the condense failed and was trash, if it got rid of those customers that they haven't used in 5 years or more, look, I've got a nice, easy way to do that.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome.
And also in the shell file instance, sometimes if you can just delete all the transactions and all you're left is your list and preferences, sometimes that's a lot easier than creating a new file. So just some things to keep in mind.
Yeah, perfect. Because if you create a brand new company file from scratch, you've got to reset up users, permissions, potentially templates, memorized reports, all that stuff, right? So if the alternative is just, I want a clean file, but I don't want to mess with any of that stuff, make a backup of the file for archive. Sorry, make a backup of the file for safekeeping, better use of terminology there. And then in the file that you still have left, do the archive condense, get rid of everything, get rid of unused lists and transactions, unused customers, vendors that haven't been used since the archive date. And you'll have a much better, cleaner file that you can then export that customer list if you wanted to use it. Yep.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense.
The other nice thing is if you have several users and they all have customized like icon bars and things like that, if you have the ability to remove all the transactions and just use that as a starting thing, now they don't have to set up all their user preferences as well. So just if it works, it's awesome.
Yeah.
If it works.
But your overall point is, in a shell file scenario, and we're using the term shell file is not a universally understood term. So basically, if you're creating a brand new company file that's empty, that doesn't have anything in it other than maybe some of the things that you do want, like lists, like your chart of accounts, like your list, customer list, your vendor list, your item list. Yep, that's what we're talking about. So perfect. I don't know if I had a complete thought there or not, but just saying, the second part of my incomplete thought was, if you're, God, what was I trying to say there? Damn it. I hate it when I lose my train of thought.
Maybe just that it does make your life easier. If you have to start a new file, you can at least get to a cleaner place. And then, you don't really care if the inventory ends up trashed or your balance sheet doesn't work anymore or whatever. You've got a smaller customer list or whatever.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to remember. It's like when you say that the company file is trashed or the financials don't work anymore or whatever, it's like, if you were doing a before and after balance sheet, it might not actually be the same balance sheet anymore. It might not actually have the same totals anymore, even if you said replace with summary journal entries, or same thing, you run a P&L and for a certain period that was maybe part of the condense, and it doesn't match anymore. So when you lose the detail, it doesn't always summarize the totals the right way.
Yeah, and just a side note, if they have a pretty simple file, and I'm going to say a glorified check register, the condense works really well. But the second you start having inventory, payroll is a big one. QuickBooks hates deleting old payroll entries. Even a lot of linking transactions, right? Like purchase order to bill to, check bill payment, etc. Those are where the condense just fails. It just does not do well. And it will even sometimes not even continue. It'll just say like, nope, can't do it.
And Tina, I'm sure you've experienced or would have some experience on that as well. Like if we were doing we've had recent experiences with migrations where invoices and payments on those invoices and deposits of those payments all have to be tied together. And as soon as one part of that isn't matched up, it does create a little bit of a nightmare. So it seems like archiving invoices that haven't been paid and deposited would be a problem with some of those types of things we do.
Absolutely. And I think one thing too, for people to understand, like you can save a backup and you can try it. If it doesn't work, no harm, no foul, right? But you also have to realize the time that you have to invest in verifying if it works, because there's a series of reports that you need to run, and there's a lot of information that you need to verify, and running verify and rebuilds. And so if you're going to do it just to see if it works, you also have to realize the time investment involved. So, when it does come to, okay, we've gotten rid of all of these unpaid invoices, but, we had one that used payments from 3 years ago to pay an invoice from this year, or they used a payment from this year to pay an old invoice from 5 or 6 years ago. And then, so you get into, you know, issues with that. So doing it's not a problem if you want to try it, right? But all of the time that's invested. So if you're going to do it, make sure you know what kind of reports to run and what you're looking for when it's done. Because just because it says it's successful doesn't mean it's truly successful.
Yeah, good point. And I think related to something you just said there, Tina, too, you talked about verify, rebuild. I imagine, again, I didn't click the button at the very end of the step-by-step process there, but it seems like it'd be smart to do a verify, rebuild, or at least a verify before you even try this, because if you've got a corrupt data file, trying to condense a corrupt data file is probably not going to make it any more clean.
It won't work if there are certain errors going into it. Like Angie said, it'll just fail. It just won't even try after a certain point. So you definitely want to do the verify and rebuild as necessary.
So let's say let's take the scenario of somebody is trying, so they're on desktop QuickBooks and they're trying to migrate to QuickBooks Online, and the file is a little bit too big. Maybe not massively too big, but just it's a little bit too big, so the automatic migration doesn't work. Is the first step to do this process, but just get rid of the audit trail and see if that gets it small enough to migrate, and or what are the next steps if we're trying to make a file a little bit smaller, so that it potentially could go through the automatic migration, or is that just not an option, basically?
Well, if memory serves, even a removal of the removal of the audit trail will not reduce your targets, because your targets are what make your file so large, and that's the portion that may be too big. So removing the audit trail is still wonderful, just because it will make it move faster, for lack of a better word. But that's not going to reduce your targets to get it under a threshold or anything like that.
Okay.
So honestly, that's where if you have a person that has a file that's, 10 plus years old, whatever, it's just giant. And they say, oh, we want to move to a new year as of, January 1st, 2026. Well, that's when you may recommend what we here at VARC call a shell file and say, okay, well, then we're going to take your customers, your vendors, your items, whatever, bring in your open AR, open AP, and that's what you're getting. And that's when some of those condense options that I talked about may be useful. But yeah, once they're over a certain target limit, I still recommend doing the shell file as of a certain point and then trying to move it over. And if you go through Intuit, they'll do the same thing. They'll tell you that, well, actually, I take that back. They will try to do the condense. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Right. And I know there's a few maybe more what I would call brute force methods to try to maybe help, but this is, I would call this more of an extreme case scenario. But like, let's say you've got customers that have been in the file for, like you said, 10 years, and let's just say there's a whole bunch of them that haven't been used in the last 5. Maybe you could go in and merge some customers, if you've got, create a customer called 2005 and older clients, and merge some of those clients into that that old client name. I don't know if that would help at all, but it would make your list a little bit smaller potentially, and maybe help, if you did that a whole bunch of times. But good stuff. Any other?
If you have a list of like 10 items, sure, that'd be awesome. But what happens is you're looking at a list of 20,000 and you're like, okay, I'm not going to merge.
Yeah. Because then you're really just back to square one, which is, maybe you could make a backup for safekeeping and then try it with, let me get rid of 2015 and older stuff and try to get rid of unused lists and transactions that haven't been used since then. Maybe that'll help. Maybe. But yeah, to Tina's point, you still got to verify, make sure the file is structurally correct, balance is still balance, all that kind of good stuff. And verify.
This is Leslie. I was just going to make a bunch of little observations.
Yeah.
When I migrated people who have incredibly large files, the best thing to do is to not migrate the inventory, because QuickBooks Desktop is average cost and QuickBooks Online is FIFO, first in, first out. So right there, you're going to get all that data doesn't need to migrate. So when you're talking about condensing for the purpose of migration, it's better to omit inventory and reset it properly. And payroll, you're going to have a different payroll program. So you can migrate pretty much any file from desktop to online if you eliminate those two components without doing a massive amount of cleanup or condensing. The only time I've had a file completely crash on me, was not able to be converted, was one that had 14,000 members listed. And that's when QBO realized that it actually does have list limits. It could, and your idea of merging, when I tried that idea, it was still the sheer volume of transactions was preventing the migration. So the merging of the names, that didn't help my cleanup effort. And that client, just FYI, had to go get a separate system, which they should have had all along for managing their membership. It's a very large not.
Yeah. Like a donor database program of some sort.
Yeah, they really did need something separate. They should not have had that kind of minutia and volume inside QuickBooks. It's just too much. Plus, moving into modern times, people like to pay by the website, and they needed to move forward with that anyway. So this was as good an excuse. But the condensing is not. I have done condensing in 5-year increments, and then only migrated the last most recent 5 years. But I've also migrated 30-year-old files, and they've all gone over if I remove the payroll and the inventory.
Okay. And I'm wondering, in the file that I'm in, I probably don't have payroll enabled, so it didn't show me a payroll screen. But I'm guessing, based on what you're saying, that if payroll was enabled, I would have probably seen a payroll option.
Well, actually, if you're talking about if you're looking inside QuickBooks Desktop and you're looking at the Condense module, that's not where you would get rid of it. Where you have the opportunity to exclude payroll and inventory is when you're in the process of the migration.
Okay.
So I rarely have had a need to do Condense an archive for desktop clients who are migrating.
Okay, perfect. All right, perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Any other comments or questions from the rest of the group? Okay, if not, I hope this was helpful. At least it gives you a little bit of insight into a couple of the related concepts. We will have this recorded and we'll share it out to everybody, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks.